The jazz blues solos left by Charlie Christian are often on incredibly simple changes, often as basic as this. This begs the question, with such basic changes to play over, how did Charlie Christian go about creating such interesting solos and, for the time, very innovative jazz language? So in this lesson, I'll break down some of his signature jazz blues soloing moves, things that you can take inspiration from for your own soloing. Now, back in 1940, Charlie Christian took part in a session for Metronome magazine, and the band was called the Metronome All-Stars, and they played a blues in C. There's 3 takes of it, and it's called All-Star Strut. Now, on each take, Charlie Christian gets 1 chorus, so being able to analyse his go at 3 solos on the same set of changes gives us great insight into how he thought and how he played. So I've transcribed those 3 solos. I'm going to play them for you now. You can get the PDFs of all 3 solos on the lowest tier of my Patreon page, link in the description. Gear-wise, I'm using this 1938 L50 that's been converted into an ES150. So at some point someone's added this modern day Charlie Christian pickup. And I'm going through a Quilter Tone Block 202, but a new bit of kit today that I'm trying out, the JJ150 pedal, which is based on the preamp of the original early Gibson amplifier that Charlie Christian used. Now, if you transcribe or learn a few Charlie Christian solos, you get used to kind of the things he likes to do, or often did. One of those is this signature arpeggio move he uses all the time over dominance. And it's something which can help us get to some of those upper extensions. And I think at this point in time, when you've got the movement from the swing to the bebop era, you have that thing where these upper extensions are getting used more. People's soloing is more harmonically rich, and that's particularly evident in Charlie's playing. Here's an example of it in one of the solos. You get it here on the G7, like that, but leading in. He walks down to it. He's going 5th to the 4th, then 3, 5, flat 7, 9, 13. Then he goes to flat 13, which is quite cool. And he really hits and accents that 13th on the top. In the second solo, in the second line, going from the second bar of F7 to C, we get this, which sounds really sweet. So that's that over an F. We got that 3, 5, flat 7, 9, 13. But what he's doing this time is he's going chromatically down to the 5th, from the 5th to the 3rd of the F. Then up the arpeggio. So he's got this signature line that we got, but he's got a nice way of getting into it. And he's linking up a 5th to the 3rd and chromatically just filling the gap between. And that note sounds great on top. Yes, it technically is the 9th because it's on the next chord, but I really hear that as still being part of the F7. To get this into playing, what I do is learn it for C7. So here, F7, G7, and try and use that in your arpeggios. And you can obviously go so that chromatic gap as well would work well too. But that's kind of like anticipating the chord, if you like. Now, we can only speculate about how Charlie Christian thought about improvising, but retrospectively, we can learn from his solos and try and think about kind of how he's approaching it. And if we took these 3 solos and did a heat map, this triad, this C major triad would light up as the heat map, if you like, where a lot of the action is happening. And really throughout those 3 solos, there's very much Charlie Christian is following the chords, but he is doing just more than simply playing, 1, 3, 5, or 1, 3, 5, 6, or 1, 3, 5, 7. And if we just took chord 1, so C as an example, I like to call, well, I kind of think of his approach as Triad plus. And what I mean by that is, say against the C chord, we have the root, third and fifths are primary tones that, he's gonna, and we can base our melodies around. Those are strong notes against the backdrop of a C. And then you could add the octave on top. So we've got 1, 3, 5, 1. And then I would say the plus element is, then you've got inside elements you can add. So we could add the 6. You hear there? We could add the flat 7. The major 7, in this particular solo, he adds it a lot underneath. There. We got the ninth on top. So if you listen, if I play an idea, I'm going to add the ninth on top. Add the 6. Strong, basic melodies that based around the chord tones, but adding in, say, the 6 or the major 7 or the flat 7 or the ninth is going to add interesting colour. Then I would say the other element of plus would be more outside notes, which in the case of Charlie Christian's solo here, it's the flat 3. Like one starts like that, 1, 6, 1, 6, flat 3, which is a riff he later plays on AML Special, but there we've got that note, and that flat 3 works great going up to the third. I'm sure you've heard that before. Like that, going flat 3, 3, 5, that sort of idea. Yeah, all interacting together nicely. Another kind of, I don't really want to call this an outside note per se, but it's a tense note, is the 4th, because against the C it creates that suspended feel, so it wants to go down to the 3rd. So in those examples, in those solos, we have heavy prominence of those chord tones, often starting the ideas on them and resolving to them, finishing on them. The introduction of those nice inside colours, and then the outside for movement, for colour. And I think that's quite a simple way to approach it. What you could do is you could take that little map I've just done there, put on just a drone of C, or just a one chord backing track of C7 or C, and just try and create ideas where you focus around the triad and then you add in some of those other elements for colour, noticing what it sounds like to resolve to the 1, 3, 5 versus the inside notes, and then experiment with the outside notes because they help bring in tension. And one of the solos even starts with that arpeggio. Super obvious in that example. And what it does expresses the triad, the key, really well, and straight away fits the harmony nicely. Good example of that triad plus at the start of this solo. Starting on the root, flat 7, 6, 5, 4 to 3, so it gives us that tension. 5, 6, flat 3, 3, root. And the classic rhythm as well at the end there. Starts on the root, finishes on the root, so strong resolute, based around that shape, but it's say like incorporating the flat 7, the 6, and the flat 3 and the 4. And for me, those help the primary tones 1 through 5 stand out. For example, in solo 2, we see in the end of the second line, that top of that triad shape, the end of the solo. Very resolute because of those chord tones. Now in this basic blues format, there aren't tons of changes, as I said at the top of the lesson. They're not those chords everywhere like you say get in a Parker blues. So sometimes, you've got a big stretch on one chord, like the opening 4 bars of C, and you might want something else going on there. And something he would routinely do is create movement and anticipation of the next chord by playing a line or or chord tones of the next chord just before it comes in. We get it in this solo at this point at the end of the second line going, we're on C, we're going to G7, on beat 3 he goes 1, 2, then we're into G7. So he's playing 3 of the G7, he's playing 3, flat 3 to the 2, to to the flat 7, then resolving to the 5th of the G7 when it comes in. So we've got those 4 notes there, just like leading us into the G7. Funny enough, he does that anticipation in exactly the same place in one of the other solos, which is again an insight into, you know, if you hear him doing the same song, playing solos over the same set changes, you start to get great insight into the way he played. So you see there, that's just before the G7 comes in, just before that line. What's he playing? 3, 4, 9, flat 7. So notes, you know, obviously got the 4th for a bit of interest, bit of movement, but the other notes are obviously great notes for the dominant. So one thing I'd encourage you to try is playing over a blues, soloing over a blues backing track, and then say, if I put blues changes on the screen, you know, you could start to play your arpeggios slightly earlier, or like I say, a line for that chord. So you come in a couple beats, a beat earlier, and then just notice how that provides some sort of sense of kind of forward momentum, and it makes things less square. You know, the chord tone approach essentially is, you know, it's C7 here, play, you know, base your ideas around C7. It's F7 here, base your ideas around F7. But if you take that too literally and be like a slave to those bar lines, everything's just all packaged neatly in the bars, and that is not what is happening on the recorded music. Obviously, sometimes it does, but there's more variety than that. The bar lines are less respected. The ideas go across the bar lines, sometimes starting before a chord. So sometimes when you're looking at a solo, you know, transcribing or listening, working out, you'll notice like some notes, I can't make sense of those notes against the chord. That's because they're chord tones of the next chord. For you to be able to play like that, I think you need to be able to recognize that in solos you learn and listen to. And also you need to be very confident about your arpeggios, and you need to be able to hear the sound of the next chord in order to have a line which starts and then leads into it. One thing that's very apparent in these 3 solos is his use of a staccato, so a short snappy note to really emphasize it and to make it stand out. Good example is how he finishes off one of those solos by starting the last C major bass line to close off his solo, like to say, hey guys, I'm done, someone else's go. He goes. So that first note is really snappy. It's got that dot above it for the staccato. So like. Now what that does really puts emphasis on that. I think it provides the kind of texture like you might get from a brass instrument. You know, his contemporaries of like, I don't know, Harry James or Lester Young. But if I play it without the staccato, listen, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But if I put the staccato back in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Suddenly just breathes a little bit more interest and energy to it. So it's something really simple. Often he'd do it at the start or the end of a phrase, or sometimes at the midpoint of a phrase, where he would do it to the highest note. But it's something I would encourage you to experiment with. So, you know, key part of playing is obviously focusing on not just what notes you play, what rhythm you play, but also how you play them. Often he's highlighting a chord tone or an interesting note against the chord, and for me what it does is it breaks up the ideas rhythmically as well. In relation to your own improvising, I think it's really easy just to get so focused on what notes you're playing. And I like to kind of analyze jazz phrases like this. You know, it's 40% notes, it's 40% rhythm, and then 20% is how you play it. And I think often a lot of us spend way too much time in that first camp, just what the notes you're playing. The rhythm gives then, you know, the phrase identity, and then that last 20%, the way you play it, with a slide, with an accent, with a like short snappy staccato, the volume you play, is the icing on the cake, but it makes all the difference to your lines. Now, something I use all the time in my own soloing that I stole from Charlie Christian is his use of the minor 4 arpeggio over the 5 chord. Let me explain that. If we're in the key of C, chord 1 is C, right? Just use basic chords here for a second. Chord 4 would be F. Chord 5 would be G. So the minor 4 is where you turn F, so our chord 4, into a minor chord. And it creates a great way to get back to 1. If you listen, if I play 1 to 4, 4 minor, so F minor, back to 1. It leads us really nicely back. Examples of jazz tunes which do it. Loads of pop songs do it, by the way, but at the start of, say, Just Friends, it does it, and also after you've gone, if you want to listen to some examples from standards where that's part of the chords. But what Charlie Christian is doing is over the G7 in the key of C in this blues, he plays an F minor 6. Which is a really neat sound. And how you want to think about this, right? You can think of, what key you're in, the 5 chord, then the minor 4. But I think just to start with, just knowing that over G7, when it's going back to chord 1, C, you could try using an F minor 6 arpeggio. Now, why it works, obviously G7's G, B, D, F, F, and that's 1, 3, 5, flat 7, F minor 6, F, A flat, C, D. We've got to think of that over the top of a G. And that becomes, rather than 1, flat 3, 5, 6, it becomes flat 7, flat 9, then we've got the 4th, or call it the 11th, and the 5th. So we've got that interesting, we've got the all-important flat 7, we've got the flat 9, and we've got that, the 11th, and the strong 5th. So it's using arpeggio substitution effectively. And a lot of those notes resolve nicely back to C because they're very close. Like F is the flat 7 of G, resolves down to the 3rd of C. You got the A flat, which will go down a semitone also. Here's the example from the solo. Minor 4 thing happened here in one of the solos. So in the last line, on the G7, we go. There's that staccato again. And then this. We got an F minor 6 arpeggio here. 6, 5, flat 3, 1. And then that anticipation of the next chord coming in. E to G, the 3rd and 5th of our C. So then instead of like G7 to C, it's F minor 6 into C. And you can hear this in chord form. Maybe if I play G7, F minor 6 to C6 maybe. You hear that. That sounds really pretty. Try it in a 2-5-1. So if I was doing D minor 7, G7 to C major, I could do D minor 7, F minor 6 to C major 7. Or perhaps if you know this, D minor 7 flat 5 is an inversion of F minor 6. So you could play this. And it's a much smoother movement than going D, G, C. And if the bass player is playing the G, you get that really nice, interesting sound there. And then down to C. Try it in your arpeggios. So F, D minor 7, F minor 6 to C. There I went G7 into F minor 6, but something for you to try. I think, some of these things, all the rules and stuff can be tricky to remember. Simple thing would be, right, if you're playing a song with a 2-5-1 in C, which I'm sure you know a song that does that, then over the G7 try playing F minor 6 instead of G7. So it's an arpeggio substitution that he would use, and it kind of gives that nice sense of tension, there. Resolve back to the 1 chord. So over the 5 chord, use the minor 4. To know that, to be able to work that out for other keys, you need to know what key you're in, obviously, what the 4 chord is, then turn that into a minor. So let's just take an example. If we were in the key of F, the 5 chord would be C7. The 4 chord would be B flat. So over the C7, you'd play B flat minor 6. Then resolve to F. So there you go, just an example of how you could transpose that approach to another key. But I would try it in your comping and both in your arpeggios and solo and practice over changes. Now, I do think when you study multiple solos from the same player like Charlie Christian, you really do start to get an insight into the way they play, and their influence rubs off on you. So I'll put up some other videos on the screen that I've made about other solos that, pick out similar ideas to today, right? I mean, he wasn't sadly alive for very long, so there's not tons and tons of recorded solos, but there's enough for us to kind of get stuck into, and plenty we can learn from him. He was such an innovative guitar player at that point in time and left such a legacy, and so many other great guitars been inspired by him. I think people like Wes Montgomery credited Charlie Christian as a big influence. So many did. Benson did. It's just one of those things that the majority of those greats have gone back in time and looked at what Charlie did and learnt some of his solos, transcribed him, taken inspiration from them. And then key thing is trying to, you might try and imitate what he does, but you try and do it in your own way, of course. I don't learn these or transcribe these solos to be able to play them note for note per se, although I have to for these videos. I do it for what can I learn from Charlie from this solo and his approach that I can adopt in my improvising. So that's my thought process about why to bother transcribing or learning solos in the first place. It's not so that I can play it in 3 years' time at a gig or something. It's purely what can I learn from it. I also find the act of transcribing just quite rewarding as well. Anyway, those are on the screen. If you've got any questions, you leave them below. Don't forget, jazz guitar lessons every Monday. Until next time, you take care.